Greetings, everyone, and welcome. I'm Elaine Lakam, and I serve along with Michelle Sherman, David Miller, and Becky McIntyre on the planning team for the third annual fall series of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. A project of Past Christian International, the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative is a global movement dedicated to promoting active nonviolence as a core principle of the gospel. This year's series focuses on nonviolence and synodality. Tonight, we will dive deeper into how these two concepts connect, shaping our collective journey as a synodal people called to embrace nonviolence as a way of life. It is our hope that this session inspires you to think deeply about the role of nonviolence in building communities that are more inclusive, just, and reflective of the value of synodality. To guide us through this insightful discussion, we are very fortunate to have Joachim Ozonze as our moderator. Joachim Ozonze is a doctorate student in a Peace Study and Theology program at the University of Notre Dame, an educational career inspired by his extensive experience as a Catholic priest in Nigeria. His background includes pastoring, teaching theology, mediating violent conflicts, and supporting families impacted by violence. His current research interests lie at the intersection of ritual, memory, identity, healing, and reconciliation, especially within context of my violence. Joachim is researching the possibility of digitally mediated Christian ritual in unlearning hatred, disrupting structures of human disposability, and inscribing a culture of life that respects the dignity of every human being. He holds degrees in philosophy and theology from the Pontifical Urban University in Rome and a master in theological study from the University of Notre Dame, where he concentrated on systematic theology with minor in peace study, digital cultures, and gender study. He is a Kellogg doctoral affiliate and a Richard and Peggy Notberg Premier Fellow. Please join me in welcoming Joachim.
Thank you for your gracious introduction, Elaine, and thanks for inviting me to moderate this evening's session. It's such a joy to be here with you all, and I would love to welcome everyone to week 5 of our ongoing reflections at the intersection of synodality and nonviolence. Special thanks again to the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative for creating this synodal space for our conversations these past weeks. And now for our opening prayer, which will be taken from a collection of prayers by Martin Luther King Jr., Thou Dear God. I would invite us, wherever you may be, to please take a deep breath and intentionally welcome the presence of the Holy Spirit. And together with all those united with us in space and time, let us pray. O God, we thank you for the lives of great saints and prophets in the past who have revealed to us that we can stand up amid the difficulties and trials of life and not give in. We thank you for our foreparents who have given us something in the midst of the darkness of exploitation and oppression to keep going. Grant that we will go on with the proper faith and proper determination of will, so that we will be able to make a creative contribution to the world. O God, make us willing to do your will, come what may. Increase the number of persons of goodwill and moral sensitivity. Give us renewed confidence in the way of nonviolence and love, as taught us by Christ. In his name and spirit, we pray. Amen. Thank you once again. It's such a joy to be here with everyone in this synodal space this evening. We'll be continuing our conversations from our last session on living a life of synodality, nonviolence in action. Even as we hold our reflections in union with the ongoing synod on synodality, which is in its final weeks now, we speak about synodality not simply as an event happening in some distant place, right? But as a way of life, as a way of being that is cultivated, that is nurtured, and that can become continually inscribed in the body of Christ as a personal and social reality. So today, we want to add another layer to this reality and hope of synodality. In our conversations this evening, we want to explicitly draw connections between synodality as a way of life and nonviolence as a way of being and acting. So how can we talk about nonviolence as a way of life for a people whose mode of being is synodality? Tonight, happily, our speakers will offer us dynamic theological frameworks for navigating these connections, as well as provide us practical wisdom for inscribing these frameworks in our everyday lives. And I'm so thrilled for our lineup of speakers this evening. Each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes. After all the speakers, will have opportunities for questions and answers. And so please feel free to type in your questions in the chat along the way, and they will be duly attended to. Our first speaker today is David Cochran. Dave will be speaking on church teaching on nonviolence. Dr. Dave Cochran is a professor of politics at Loras College in Dubuque, Iowa. Originally from Lubbock, Texas, he received his BA from Drew University and his MA and PhD from the University of Maryland. His primary teaching and research areas are war and peace, religion, race, and ethnicity in American politics, political thought, and Irish studies. In addition to many articles and book chapters, he has published 6 books. Most recently, The Catholic Case Against War, A Brief Guide, which came out from the University of Notre Dame Press this past March. Yay! In addition to his work in the politics program, Dr. Cochran directs or co-directs the college's Peace and Justice minor and Irish Studies minor. We're so excited to have Dr. Dave Cochran with us. Welcome, Dr. Dave. We're excited to hear your conversation today on church teaching on violence. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. There we are. All right. Are you all able to see that?
Yes.
Excellent. Good. Well, yes. Thank you, Joachim, for that great introduction, and the rest of you for the invitation and for tuning in. I think my contribution will be to kind of set the context or the larger stage for what Eli and Stephen will get into in a little bit more depth. And I'd like to talk about why this imperative of embracing nonviolence and working to end all war is an essential element of what it means to be Catholic, a synodial church today. And the basis for saying this is, I figure the most straightforward way to illustrate it or to hopefully convince you of it is to consider the words of recent popes themselves. So I just have drawn on actual words from recent popes to kind of illustrate why this embracing nonviolence and working to end all war is an essential element of what it means to be church today. So bit of context before we jump in. So as most of you know, historically, the way the Catholic tradition analyzed issues of war and peace was the just war tradition. But recently being the past 5, 6, 7 decades, the church has been moving towards a much more critical view of war and transitioning to a framework often characterized, as Eli will get into, as just peace. So part of this transition is the just war framework historically looked at individual wars. Is this war just or is that war just? Whereas increasingly the church looks at war as a phenomenon and is critical of war itself as a human practice. So to illustrate some of these condemnations of war itself that increasingly come from the Vatican and from popes, from magisterial teaching. A couple quotes from John Paul II, famously, "No, never again war, which destroys the lives of innocent people, teaches how to kill, throws into upheaval even the lives of those who do the killing, and leaves behind a trail of resentment and hatred, thus making it all the more difficult to find a just solution to the very problems which provoked the war." And later he says, "Nothing is resolved by war. On the contrary, everything is placed in jeopardy by war." He also once wrote, "Recent history clearly shows the failure of recourse to violence as a means for resolving political and social problems. War destroys, it does not build up, it weakens the moral foundations of society and creates further divisions and long-lasting tensions." And then more recently, Pope Francis has written, never war, I think most of all about the children whose hopes for a dignified life, a future, are dashed. Dead children, wounded children, mutilated children, orphans. Stop it, please. I beg you with all my heart. It's time to stop." And then an interesting shift in this condemnation of war itself. The church struggling with this idea whether a just war can even be conceived anymore, whether kind of as a similar shift to the death penalty, where it went from asking, is this particular application of the death penalty just or not, to condemning the death penalty itself as an institution. As far back as John the 23rd, given the terrifying destructive force of modern weapons, it no longer makes sense to maintain that war is a fit instrument with which to repair the violation of justice. Pope Benedict XVI, today we should be asking ourselves if it's still licit to admit the very existence of a just war. And then Pope Francis, talking about St. Augustine, forged a concept of just war that we no longer uphold in our own day. And most recently, there is no such thing as a just war. They do not exist. So this condemnation of war itself, this continual interrogation of war as an unjust, brutal, destructive violation of human dignity around the world, leads the church also to a hopeful but clear demand to abolish war. So it's not just enough, the church doesn't just say war is terrible, war is wrong. It has a vision for abolishing war as well. It's abolitionist. So Vatican II, God urgently demands of us that we free ourselves from the age-old slavery of war. John Paul II, war should belong to the tragic past, to history. It should find no place in humanity's agenda for the future. And also he demanded that humanity must proceed resolutely towards outlawing war completely. Pope Francis then, may humanity understand that the moment has come to abolish war, to erase it from human history. So this explicitly abolitionist stance, again, kind of akin to the abolitionist stance the church has taken when it comes to the death penalty. So how do we get there? For the church, contemporary Catholic teaching, ending war means embracing nonviolence, non-military alternatives to conflict resolution, and addressing war's underlying causes. This is the abolitionist peacemaking agenda that popes have been articulating. For nonviolence, here's Pope John Paul II. Those who built their lives on the value of nonviolence have given us a luminous and prophetic example. Pope Francis, the force of arms is deceptive, and nonviolence, he says, is more powerful than violence. Again, Pope Francis, in the most local and ordinary situations and in the international order, may nonviolence become the hallmark of our decisions, our relationships and our actions, and indeed of political life in all its forms. And again, Pope Francis, from that same statement, active nonviolence is a way of showing that unity is truly more powerful and more fruitful than conflict. I pledge the assistance of the church in every effort to build peace through active and creative nonviolence. In addition to nonviolence, the church has urged global cooperation to find alternative ways, non-military ways, non-violent ways of conflict resolution. John Paul II, For world peace is inconceivable unless the world's leaders come to recognize that interdependence in itself demands the abandonment of the politics of blocks, the sacrifice of all forms of economic, military, or political imperialism, and the transformation of mutual distrust into collaboration. He says we need to set aside war and an unacceptable exaggerated concern for security, which deadens the impulse towards united cooperation by all for the common good of the human race. The church strongly endorses international law. John Paul II, peace and international law are closely linked to each other. Law favors peace. Benedict XVI, it bears repeating, power must always be disciplined by law, and this applies also to the relations between sovereign states. International law underpins international institutions where you can find nonviolent, non-military ways to address and solve conflicts. Benedict XVI calls for a true world political authority. Pope John the 23rd, disputes which may arise between nations must be resolved by negotiation and agreement, not by recourse to arms. John Paul II, what is needed are concrete steps to create or consolidate international structures capable of intervening through appropriate arbitration in the conflicts which arise between nations. And most directly, Pope Francis calls for tireless recourse to negotiation, mediation, and arbitration rather than armed conflict. One of the big priorities for the church in the international arena is the arms trade, cutting off the flow of arms to war zones. What John Paul II says, and what of the violence inherent not only in wars as such, but in the scandalous arms trade, which spawns the many armed conflicts which stain our world with blood. Benedict XVI calls it a baleful commerce. It accelerates instability, tension, and conflict, creates the need for concrete agreements aimed at effective demilitarization. And Pope Francis laments the vast amounts of resources that are diverted to military ends and away from the everyday needs of young people, families experiencing hardship, the elderly, the infirm. The third part is addressing the roots of war, the underlying causes that drive violent conflicts, and to non-violently prevent conflicts before they start. Vatican II talked about violent conflict being rooted in excessive economic inequalities, where some countries with a majority of citizens who are counted as Christians have an abundance of wealth, whereas others are deprived of the necessities of life and tormented with hunger, disease, and every kind of misery. John Paul II, our world also shows increasing evidence of another grave threat to peace. Many individuals and indeed whole peoples are living today in conditions of extreme poverty. The gap between rich and poor has become more marked, even in the most economically developed nations. And later he says, war springs from injustices suffered, legitimate aspirations frustrated, poverty, and the exploitation of multitudes of desperate people. So this is why the church, as part of its peacemaking agenda, endorses economic development, which Paul VI famously called a new name for peace. Pope John Paul II talked about a world that is more just and prosperous for all. He called for a concerted worldwide effort to promote development, an effort which also involves sacrificing the positions of income and power enjoyed by the more developed economies. And Pope Francis says there can be no true peace unless we show ourselves capable of developing a more just economic system. And then the last element is also political justice, the promotion of democracy and human rights, as Benedict says, the consolidation of democratic regimes capable of ensuring freedom and peace. And John Paul II called to replace corrupt, dictatorial, and authoritarian forms of government by democratic and participatory ones to ensure the health of a political community as expressed in the free and responsible participation of all citizens in public affairs, the rule of law, and respect for the promotion of human rights. So this is why, according to the magisterial teaching of the church, embracing nonviolence and working to end all war is not an optional kind of element of our faith. It's essential to what it means to be church today. And I hope it provides a context for some of the things that Eli and Stephen will be addressing in more depth. So I'll stop there and thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Dave. That was great. Thank you really for framing our conversation tonight on nonviolence, especially as the church teaches from different teachings, papal teachings. Thank you so much for just setting the tone for our conversation. And please remember to type in your questions or comments in the chat. Now we'll hear from our next speaker, who will take this conversation forward from this broad framework of nonviolence, this movement from not just a just war, but now a just peace framework. Our next speaker will be Eli McCarthy. Dr. Eli McCarthy is a distinguished scholar and practitioner in the field of nonviolence. He teaches theology and justice and peace studies at Georgetown University. He's the author of A Just Peace Ethic Primer and Becoming Nonviolent Peacemakers. Eli served as Director of Justice and Peace for the Conference of Major Superiors of Men from 2012 to 2020, and Senior Policy Advisor for the Catholic Labor Network from 2020 to 2022. Since 2023, he has been a Just Peace Fellow at the Franciscan Action Network, focusing on addressing conflicts in Ukraine and Palestine. He's also the co-founder and director of programs for the DC Peace Team, which offers training in nonviolent communication, restorative circles, bystander intervention, anti-racism, trauma awareness, and deploys unarmed civilian protection units. Tonight, Eli will be speaking on the Just Peace Framework and the war in Gaza. Welcome, Eli.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with you all. Really excited for this conversation and being with some really great co-panelists here. So I'm going to do kind of two things. One is to kind of unpack a little bit this Just Peace framework that's part of this trajectory that Dave kind of laid out, and then look at the case of Palestine and Israel and how this way of reasoning and imagining may contribute to kind of transforming this particular that particular situation. So let me begin that with kind of going back to Vatican II, where the way of Jesus had been increasingly reappropriated for today's context, drawing theology toward a way of just peace. At Vatican II, there was a shift to learn more or lean more towards virtue ethics and to extend the call to holiness to all lay people. This corresponding trend toward just peace has continued, especially with Pope Francis. Now, ecumenically, across kind of the Christian traditions, the United Church of Christ formally declared itself a Just Peace Church in 1985. And then in 2011 and 2013, the World Council of Churches produced documents entitled Ecumenical Call to Just Peace and then Way of Just Peace. Since 2016, 3 global Catholic conferences in Rome and multiple regional gatherings with many voices from violent conflict zones have energized this movement, along with Pope Francis, such as his World Day of Peace message in 2017 that was entitled Nonviolence, a Style of Politics for Peace. This September, the Catholic Nonviolence Institute was launched in Rome to support the Vatican and the broader Catholic global community. In turn, a Just Peace ethical framework or process has arisen from and within a pastoral approach that listens to the experiences and voices of people in hostile conflict situations across various cultures. This envisions just peace as a way in accord with human dignity for the common good, the care of our ecological home, the prevention of violence, and a focus on the transformation of conflict by nonviolent strategies. So just peace norms operate in three distinct spheres that may overlap in time and space, and they apply to all stages of conflict. The logic is that strategies chosen must enhance or at least not obstruct these norms. Such just peace strategies are always contextual with attention to those most impacted. And sustaining spiritual disciplines are critical to the fruitful exercise of these norms. So there's three basic categories. One, virtues and skills to transform conflict. Second, norms to break cycles of violence. And third, norms for building sustainable peace. So in the first kind of category, we have norms such as virtuous habits, mercy, hospitality, justice, compassion, education and training in key nonviolent skills like nonviolent communication, analysis of root causes, intersectional analysis, participatory processes, and actions that help us form more nonviolent peacemaking communities or institutions or cultures. So notably in Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis points to this category when he proposes, quote, processes of encounter that build a people that can accept differences, unquote. He has also called us, quote, to become nonviolent people and to build nonviolent communities that care for our common home, unquote. The second category is norms to help us break cycles of violence. So the first one here is reflexivity. How do we keep the means consistent with the ends and congruent with the ends? Second, rehumanization. So actions through the language we use, the labels, the narratives we focus on, that they rehumanize all parties in the conflict. Third, conflict transformation. So strategies that help address root causes can involve consistent dialogue, trust building, trauma reduction. Fourth, norms that are consistent with nonviolent direct action, such as civil resistance, unarmed civilian protection, civilian-based defense. Fifth, strategies that lean us towards acknowledging responsibility for harm, such as restorative justice mechanisms. And six, integral disarmament. This is that sense that we need to reduce or disarm the hatred and the bitterness in our hearts in order to also have a significant impact on reducing external weapons in our countries and in our world. So it's an integral process of disarmament. In Fratelli Tutti, Francis says, quote, every act of violence committed against a human being is a wound. Every violent death diminishes us as people. Violence leads to more violence. We must break this cycle, which seems inescapable, unquote. The last category is building sustainable peace. So these include norms like relationality and reconciliation across all sectors of society, robust civil society and just governance, ecological justice and sustainability, human dignity and rights, economic, gender, and racial justice. So there's a Just Peace Ethic Primer book that provides a set of US and international cases that work with and refine this ethic. These include US immigration cases, environmental racism, civil war in South Sudan, ISIS in Iraq, gang violence in El Salvador, gender-based violence in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So when we look at a particular case and try to work with, imagine from the lens of a Just Peace framework, here are some possible reflections or lines of effort. Since the horrendous October 7th attacks in Israel, over 40,000 Palestinians have been killed, including over 70% of them women and children, along with forced starvation. The International Court of Justice has ruled this consistent with the plausible genocide. In accord with just peace, it is imperative to focus on breaking the dynamics and cycles of violence. For instance, a just peace approach would include rehumanization, actions that rehumanize the parties involved, rather than actions such as calling persons or groups human animals, evil, or even denying a humanitarian crisis. Rehumanization and rights call us to prioritize robust humanitarian aid and extensive safe corridors to evacuate elderly, people with disabilities, children, and others seeking safety. The just peace norm of conflict transformation focuses us on engaging the stakeholders in relentless negotiations with the help of credible messengers and getting as best we can to the root causes. For example, over 100 hostages were actually released through Qatar's mediation with Hamas in exchange for political prisoners. The just peace norm of acknowledging responsibility for harm would also help to shift the dynamic if some key civil society or political leaders would increasingly model such acknowledgement, as was done in South Africa to help break out of the cycle of violence during apartheid. A political process with the right credible messengers could focus on handing over, detaining, or undermining those responsible for harm in Israel and Gaza as a step toward accountability. War is not accountability. Retribution is not accountability. Such practices only increase the likelihood of recidivism and cycles of violence and thus generational trauma. We now see the war expanding into the West Bank, Lebanon, Iran. The just peace norm of nonviolent direct action draws us to increase support for the nonviolent resistance that's happening in Israel, in Palestine, and in the US. It also illuminates the critical role of scaling up accompaniment in unarmed civilian protection deployments, such as to the West Bank. One example are some recent US Christian delegations that focused on accompanying those in danger in the West Bank to increase a sense of safety. In contrast, if the US continues to send weapons to Israel, we will increase the dehumanization and the trauma. Yes, all of us have a right to security. Yet, how we choose to ensure security or defend ourselves can either perpetuate cycles of violence and trauma, or it can interrupt and break such cycles. Claims to the, quote, right to defense, aligned with calls for having proportional violent responses, especially by our Catholic president and other Catholic commentators, have and will only continue the war and the trauma. The just peace norm of integral disarmament challenges us to support an arms embargo to generate the political conditions for a permanent ceasefire and a more sustainable just peace. So I'll end with saying, as Catholics in the US, we have a massive opportunity and responsibility. If mass slaughter and plausible genocide are not enough to take significant risk, such as social risk, disruptions, and even civil disobedience, then when? When do we live into the cross? When do we look Jesus in the eye and say, yes, I am with you? Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Eli. Thank you for expounding this framework of just peace, not simply as an opposite of just war, but as something much deeper that seeks to disrupt multiple intersecting cycles of violence. Thank you. And thanks to all those who are already putting in questions in the chat box. Our next speaker, Stephen Niamke, will take this further to unpack a particular instantiation of a vision of just peace. Stephen Niamke is a grassroots relationship-based community organizer and level 2 trainer in Kingian nonviolence skills. Hailing from Roanoke, Virginia, with a deep commitment to social justice and nonviolence, Stephen currently serves as the national field organizer for Pax Christi USA, where he mobilizes communities around the nation in the pursuit of nonviolent approaches to achieving justice and peace. He founded an organization called Friends of Event Spring that is effectively advocating for peace, justice, and healing in Roanoke, Virginia. Their work has the potential to serve as a model for communities all across the nation. Please join me in welcoming Stephen, who will be speaking to us this evening on Kingian nonviolence. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you. First, I want to express thanks to Michelle and Eliane for reaching out to me in particular. I want to acknowledge the saints and the angels on the call because I know you're out there. And I've had the opportunity to meet the other panelists in person, as well as to find out about how wonderful their work is. So I want to begin with those acknowledgments. And I will share my screen. Okay. So I'm going to tell, in 10 minutes, I'm going to tell the story of an organization called Friends of Evans Spring. But first, I want to just say a little bit more about me because I'm not an academic per se. My devotion to nonviolence comes from a very personal place. It comes from, what I'm going to say is going to be shocking. It comes from my grandfather being lynched, and it comes from my mother having to deal with that trauma for 67 years, the last 67 years of her life, and not being able to talk about it. And it comes from my family being enslaved for centuries. So my primary identity is really not about what I do in terms of my work. It's about my permanent identities. I'm a son, I'm a grandson, I'm a brother, I'm a father, I'm a social worker, organizer, so on and so forth. So I just want to acknowledge that. And I just put a few things up here about who I am personally that I'm not going to get into, but I'm going to ask you all to do that in your own relationships. Because as I was mentioned in my introduction, this is a relationship-based movement. It means getting to know people, not only people that are like you, but people that are different from you, particularly people who are different from you. So I'm going to talk about what we did with Friends of Evans Spring. We'll go through this pretty quickly. We're not going to read this piece. It's just an example of a centering or a prayer, which is critical in nonviolence work because we have to begin with centering ourselves. If we're angry, we're not going to be effective. If we're not at peace within ourselves on some level, we're not going to be effective. It's just another example of a centering. These are the 6 principles or the will of Kingian nonviolence. I'm going to go through them very quickly. Number 1, nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. Number 2, the beloved community is a framework for the future. Number 3, attack forces of evil, not persons doing evil. 4, accept suffering without retaliation for the sake of the cause to achieve the goal. 5, avoid internal violence of the spirit as well as external physical violence. And lastly, the universe is on the side of justice. Okay, so there's more to this than just reading the principles. There are exercises and time and workshops that we do to instill these principles in folk. Friends of Evans Spring has been around for 2.5 years. We never thought it would take that long, but it's still going on. And the issue of Evans Spring is going on 15 years that it's been around. Evans Spring is, well, I'll tell you about that in a minute. Let me just keep going with this. There's also the skill. So there's taking those 6 principles and applying them to actually 6 steps of community organizing that are outlined here: information gathering, education, personal commitment, negotiation, direct action, and reconciliation. This all comes directly from Martin Luther King's work, as compiled and organized by David Jensen and Dr. Bernard Lafayette Jr. You'll notice that these are in a circle because they overlap. And for that matter, these principles overlap as well. Oh, you know what? I'm not changing my screen, am I? Let me get caught up with you all. I was changing it on my other computer. I am so sorry. Okay. Are y'all with me?
Yes. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So just to review really quickly, since I didn't do it right, is this is my introduction, a little bit about me. Here's an example of a centering, another example of a centering, the 6 principles, the 6 steps, and again, they overlap. This is the case study about Evan Spring. Basically, it's a story of urban renewal, so to speak, that is told in this book, Root Shock, which basically talks about how the city waged war against its own citizens, a war without bloodshed, bullets, or bombs. Essentially, the city wiped out an African-American community so they could build businesses. And that included wiping out a cemetery and just dumping the body somewhere else. Okay. This is more about the case study for Evan Spring. Again, I'm not going to read that, but it goes into detail about the redlining and the urban renewal, so on and so forth. So the question I want you to consider as we go through this is, what is the issue in your community that might be effectively addressed through Kingian principles and practices? I think they're effective everywhere, wherever you apply them. Just some pictures of Evan Spring. It's basically it's an oasis in Northwest Roanoke, which is 95% Black. And I'm gonna get right into the information gathering and the steps as we applied them. We did some research on maps and history. We did some research on property value and understanding wetlands and water tables. Then we moved into the education step and we developed partners with people, not necessarily official partners, but people that we collaborated with and who understand what our cause was, and they basically helped us with our training, directly or indirectly. Artists in the community got involved in the work that we were doing. Are you all seeing this okay? Because I can't see you all until.
Yes, we see you,
Looks
Stephen.
good. Yeah.
You doing? Okay. All right. We participated in a parade, and that was part of how we did outreach and education, as well as how we built relationships. We did research on tree canopy, and I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this one yellow spot is where Evan Spring is in Northwest Roanoke. Can you all see my cursor?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And then over here, the urban heat island effect. And both of these are on the city's website as important issues for them. So you need to note that. This little blue spot right here is the prominent blue spot in Northwest Roanoke. Okay. More, and again, this is on the city's website when they're talking about what their goals and values are. So we called them on that. Step 3 is personal commitment. And we just did some history. We learned about the history of people who made that commitment and how much courage it took to do that. We did some internal work. We read a book called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. We talked about we need to be the same outwardly or as above as we needed to be below. And we recognized that 55% of the conflict was going to happen within our group. And that was true. Sometimes it was more than 55%. And we talked about relationships, particularly if you have a leadership group that is a targeted or minoritized group. There tends to be this seesaw between allyship and saviorism. So we did deep work on that. And I created this chart with some help of some other folks that talked about what it felt like to be leading an organization that was being targeted by people in power. And these are other training topics that we went into. The 4 pillars of Kingian nonviolence, the aggression conciliation model, defining what violence is. And all of these things come from Martin Luther King's work. But the thing I really want to highlight is this whole idea of a productive, meaningful, transformational conflict. King looked at conflicts with other people as an opportunity. And of course, we studied his campaigns. We used quotes that we emulated, go to the people, live with them, learn from them, love from them, start with what they know, build on what they have. With the best of leaders, when the work is done and the task accomplished, the people will say, we've done this ourselves. And then this comes from the 5 dysfunctions of a team. If you could get all the people in an organization rowing in the same direction, you could dominate any industry in any market against any competition at any time. And frankly, I think that's why Pax Christi is such a powerful organization, because I think they get that concept. Step 4, negotiation. We started with us. Negotiation starts within the group. And so whenever we did an action or did anything, here we're at City Council holding up signs that say protect Evan Spring on one side and I vote on the other side. And we sent out a thank you and posted it on Facebook because we understood we needed to negotiate with our own members to get them to continue. And we talked about voter registration. We registered people to vote. We did education about the same day voter registration. We got people to sign petitions, so on and so forth. We used this particular model of persuasion, recognizing that we have some active opponents and passive opponents, people who are neutral, but our goal is to make them all active allies. So we talk strategically about how that happens. We interviewed our city council members, or we posted previous quotes about how they felt about Evan Spring when they were saying they were not going to let it develop. I'm going to go through, not going to show all of those, but we went through all of our council members. Okay. This piece right here, these are roads that come from a mall in Roanoke called Valley View, and they end where Evan Spring begins. And it gave us an idea of what we were up against. They had already had some plans in place and had invested some money in it. So we needed to know that as we negotiated. Come on, computer. There we go. Step 5, direct actions. This is what you do when the negotiations break down. So they approved a plan to pave over Evan Spring and to take away the trees. And so what we did, my computer is moving slow, I'm sorry. We did a candidate forum. We had all 7 of our current candidates running for office. We made the front page of the newspaper on the following Sunday, and we have documentation that they are going to vote against the plan when it comes up again. And then we did a mayoral forum. Come on, computer, you can do it. Where we had all 3 of our mayor candidates, and same process. And we tried to use the media and get them to support what we were doing. Step 6, conciliation or reconciliation. And there's this idea based on the research that we've done that, and I think some of you have heard of this before, that nonviolent protests are twice as likely to succeed as a violent campaign, and that the threshold of getting 3.5% of a population involved has always been effective. Here's some books, just as a point of reference. Again, just some words to encourage people. Rest can feel like a risk when the world is aching, but exhaustion and disembodiment will not save us. I don't survive by your exhaustion, nor you mine. Don't abandon yourself. In other words, this is hard work. You have to plan to take care of yourself. and we often in this work we often neglect ourselves. Just another poem about hope, another way to center. For Nonviolent Heart, you all are familiar with that most likely if you're familiar with Pax Christi International. Again, just some words about framing what's happening in our country. I've gone through some additional training called Harness Our Power to End Political Violence. We can schedule that anytime people want. I like this quote by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Fight for the things you care about, but do so in a way that will lead others to join you. There's my contact information. And I think that's it. Is that the last slide? Yeah. Okay, so I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you. This has really been, I mean, just an amazing set of presentations with Dave broadly framing our conversation and nonviolence, and Eli moving us to dive deeper beyond war using the framework of just peace to enter into unpacking multiple intersecting cycles of violence with the lens of just peace. And now Stephen offering us a particular imagination of a more just and peaceful world through Kingian nonviolence, but also how this theological framework can become a way of life and a way of being. Thank you so much for serving us this amazing points of reflections this evening. So now we'll open the floor for Q&A. We already have some questions in the chat. We'll try to prioritize questions from students, but also feel free if you want to raise your hand or use the hand button and you just want to ask your question directly, that's fine as well. But we'll begin our Q&A sessions with some of the questions we already have in the chat. And one of the questions from Ayana is, how might the discussion around just peace and synodality be used to address or ease the political divide in the church, to the end that we might come together to create a more just society? And speakers, please feel free to chime in, anyone. But how might the discussion around just peace and synodality be used to address or at least ease the political divide in the church, to the end that we might come together to create a more just society? Great question.
I don't mind taking a stab at answering first. One of the things that strikes me is, so I'm a political scientist, right? So one of the things I study is polarization. And I think the question is right. If the church itself weren't so divided on questions of nonviolence and war and peace and conflict, it would be a much more effective voice, right? 1 billion Catholics could have a really big impact. And synodality, I think, is one of the answers. So in political science, well, some of you, especially if you live in a swing state, this is the door knocking season, right? You've had your door knocked, or you're maybe door knockers yourselves, trying to get people to come out to vote and things like that. One of the things canvassers or door knockers do is try and raise awareness about an issue, convince you to support their cause on climate change or immigration or something. And there's an interesting study that it's not that effective. But the most effective strategy is when you knock on a door and you ask someone how they feel about an issue, share their views and their stories, and you just listen for 5 minutes. And it turns out that has a huge impact on loosening polarization. So synodality is about just listening to stories. And so according to the social science, one of the cures for polarization is stop talking, just listen. And that breaks down barriers and helps unfreeze polarization. It's not a miracle cure, but at least from a political science perspective, that's one way synodality is pretty powerful medicine.
Wow, that's pretty profound. I didn't know if Stephen or Eli would want to jump in.
Yeah, I'll chime in. That's part of the reason why I did an extra kind of little bit of an introduction of myself is because I don't think we really know each other. I don't think we really take the time to find out who your neighbor is. You know, and there's a thousand reasons for that, and sometimes it can't be avoided, but I really think we need to recognize that all of us go through a process for how we become who we are. And that process is the same across the board. It's where we get our information, it's who we associate with, it's who's in our families, it's the media that we take in. And if we recognize that and we are willing to approach people and listen, as Dave was just saying, I think it can make all the difference. We need to build those relationships with people who are different from us, as well as people who are like us.
True. I have one question for Dave, but I didn't know if Eli wanted to chime in on this question as well before we go to the next question.
I would just add briefly, part of the contribution of the synodal kind of invitation, I think, is a kind of listening that listens for particular things. That is, in the political context, we can have a tendency to listen for what is their political position on immigration, or what is their political position on climate, right? Do I agree? Do I disagree? Here's where they're wrong. Here's where they're right. Here's where the data. But if we can practice listening underneath those political positions for what are the needs that they're trying to meet through these political strategies in this context, right? Sometimes most of what we do and say in our lives are strategies to get our needs met, like a need for respect or belonging, being seen, being heard, safety, boundaries. So I think synodality invites us to enter into that practice of trying to listen for the needs underneath the political positions, and then making proposals rooted in trying to get those needs met. And they may look like certain political positions. They may look like something really different. They may look like things that civil society does in addition or beyond what a certain policy looks like. So I would just add that in the context of like reflecting on synodality.
Wow, that's beautiful. Thanks, Eli. We have a question for Dave, but there is also a contribution from Kim on this question. Amazing. And I don't know if Kim would want to unmute herself and just share this beautiful thought she's bringing to the table. Kim?
I suppose I can unmute.
Yes.
Thank you. I think that if the church would move the world beyond war and violence, it must no longer treat dominance as moral. Authoritarian regimes, worship of weapons, empire building, genocide, systemic violence, and war are all rooted in the belief that dominance is moral. This is first taught in the family, and it affects brain development, increasing propensity towards personal violence and support of societal violence. One of the main ways it's expressed in families is through the dominance of men over women. When the Vatican talks about women, I get the impression that they're talking about an alien species that I've never encountered. It's hard for me then to consider the church as an authority on nonviolence, like when I hear Fratelli Tutti, or I had a lot of faith in the Synod, a lot of high hopes in the Synod, and I'm frustrated right now at the news coming out of it. So my questions are, is the church capable of leading people spiritually on a path of nonviolence? And when will it learn how not to dehumanize the majority of the population, since it dehumanizes more than just women in this way? And perhaps it will need nonviolence practitioners in order to bring it to that point. And I'd like your comments.
Wow. Thanks, Kim. Thank you.
Kim, I know Kim. We've had some conversations about not only nonviolence, but what she calls active love. Thank you, Kim, for that. And so what you're talking about, Kim, is exactly what I was saying about the as above, so below. You know, if we're not doing this inwardly, we're not going to do it effectively outwardly. I'm reminded of a time. I'm a basketball coach. I was a basketball coach, and we had this program that we were developing. And I said to the other four coaches, this program will go the way that we go. If we're unified and organized and committed, then the program will grow the way that we want. And if we're not, it's going to show on the outside. And that's exactly what's happening with the Catholic Church. And I believe that's exactly what happens with any organization. If we're not sincere and focused inwardly and practicing what we preach, it's not going to play out on the outside. Thank you, Kim.
And speaking about practicing what we preach, I just love those sparks of moments of active love, moments of just peace, moments of light, like this moment right now where, and this may sound funny, but right in this space we have in our group of panelists, a political scientist, a nonviolent scholar, a community organizer, all together speaking about just peace and nonviolence. Like, I couldn't imagine these three coming together in a bar for a drink. And I just wonder whether I'm just taking note, oh yeah, exactly, taking note of your backgrounds, both your intellectual, academic backgrounds, your work backgrounds, and your relationships. I mean, this is hopeful, and I wonder whether you have suggestions to give to especially college students, right? No matter what their area of study might be, to consider nonviolence as a way of life.
Yeah, let me start. I want to kind of pick up a little more on question here that was raised and kind of lead into that second question. So, Kim, I think you bring up some really good points, and you know, it's something that I struggle with as well in a number of ways, and you know, I think one of the things that can help is, first of all, kind of recalling that the church is rooted in Jesus, right? That relationship with Jesus. And we build up structures and institutions to try to move that relationship forward. And the church has a history where there were times when the Catholic Church supported really horrendous things, right? Like torture was legitimated, slavery was legitimated, colonialism was legitimated, the death penalty. And yet, all of these things over a period of years and struggle and challenge and resistance within and from without or around, these changed. These developed into something better. There continues to be repair that needs to be done and trauma that needs to be healed and so forth. So there's Jesus, and there's this history of change and development and conversion. And we certainly need to continue that process. And I think, you know, one of the questions that we can ask is the Spirit capable of change, right? Because this is what gives life to the church. So if we can trust and live into that Spirit, then we can contribute to this transformation of our church community. And I think this feeds into that question about the way of life of nonviolence, right? Where we really take seriously this journey that each of us are on, the relationships we're in, how we treat the people we live with, the people we work with, what we consume during the day, right? What virtues do we develop? Are we becoming more compassionate, courageous, just? So then when we get into these other situations where there's perhaps a nonviolent campaign or a movement or a war, we're the kinds of people that have a better possibility of imagining a way out and staying persistent with active nonviolence through really difficult kind of moments.
Yeah. Thanks, Eli. Thank you. And you even hit at something very important, especially oppositions and difficulties in imagining the impossible, right? The unattainable, right? For example, we talk about, is it possible to abolish war, for example? But then when we remember that there are things that have been abolished in the past, right? That were norms in the past, then they give us hope for today, right? That yes, it is possible, and we can imagine what it looks like. And on that point, I would like to also ask, many regions in the global South experience profound violence today, including state violence and war. How can synodality empower the global church to stand with the oppressed in these areas that don't make it to the front page of newspapers? And in the spirit of synodality, anyone can chime in.
I can start just briefly. I think that, I mean, it comes back to that listening thing. When I did research on, Catholic teaching on war and peace, a lot comes from John Paul II, mainly because he was Pope for so long. He wrote a ton about war and peace and nonviolence. And I was struck by just how much of it came out of his own experience living through the 20th century, Nazism, communism, solidarity movement. So the church teaching on that score really came out of lived experience, but in this case, the lived experience of a European. So listening to the global South, which is the center of gravity of the church, will, I hope, if the Spirit leads in the right direction, lead to a similar kind of surfacing of wisdom out of lived experience. So I think it really is that listening to the experiences people have in their lives and drawing from that, and that's what synodality is all about.
I wasn't sure. Oh, yeah. Stephen, please.
I was just going to say, I think it goes back to start again. We need to start internally and really listening to each other, because, I'm hearing that this divide within the church. Well, let's deal with that first. Why is it that we have different perspectives? Why is it that we have this very active, progressive group of Catholics? Another group, you remember that chart about the allies, the people who are the opponents and who are the allies. We have that same dynamic within the church, within the Catholic community. So I think we need to start there and deal with the bigger part of our conflict before we can effectively deal with the rest of the world.
And maybe as we gradually come to the end of our conversations, I also wonder whether, especially as we talk of just peace, as we talk of nonviolence, but also as we talk of people coming from different backgrounds, right? Different orientations, different understandings, different ways of looking at life. How do we draw the line, or how do we hold together the fact of different opinions, the fact of differences, but also unity, right? That as we speak of polarization in the church, right, as an obstacle to witnessing to nonviolence, right? That there could be legitimate different opinions, but still a witness against polarization. How does that come to happen in the church? Maybe I could rephrase, like, how is it possible to journey together as a synodal people, still having, or maybe not, different opinions all across the spectrum? right? As a witness to against polarization, but to nonviolence.
I think I'll kind of draw on my political science background a little bit again when it comes to depolarization. And this gets to what Stephen has been mentioning a few times. It's the sharing of stories, right? So you can't erase the differences. You don't want to erase the differences. Human beings are narrative creatures. If you just think about Jesus didn't have like a 10-point plan. He taught in stories, in parables. So telling each other our stories allows us to have some kind of common ground and understand each other and have some kind of participatory model. And it's not just about listening, but it's also about inclusion as well. So I'm thinking of Kim's question again. And yeah, I think one of the reasons the Vatican has always had so much trouble talking about women is that so few people there have the lived experience of being a woman. And they might say, hey, we listen to women, but unless you have an inclusive conversation where stories are shared by everyone, you can't actually have the authentic experiences that inform commonality within the reality of difference.
And Kim touched on this whole piece about patriarchy, about sexism within the church and violence within the church. That's not all gone yet. And we need to deal with that. So it's not just about listening, but it's about people having a voice and a role that makes a difference. And there's a lot of resistance to that. And I think it's holding us back.
And perhaps the last round of questions. But really, when we encounter folks who do these amazing works on nonviolence and peace and active love and these beautiful work of building God's kingdom on earth, right? In the midst of many obstacles, we often wonder what keeps them going. Like, what is it that keeps you, Stephen, that keeps you, Dave, that keeps you, Eli, doing the work you do in spite of the many obstacles and challenges that surrounds this kind of work? If any of you would like to share.
Well, first of all, it's not work. It's a lifestyle. And, I put the slide up about introducing myself, and one of the items I put it up there quickly and took it down. One of the items in there is that my grandfather has appeared to me in my dreams, and I've noticed that his appearances have been fewer since I've started working at Pax Christi USA. And I think that's his way of saying, hey, you're doing what you need to do. But I'm going to show up every once in a while just to let you know that I'm watching. But when I started working there for like the first 4 or 5 months, he never showed up, but he showed up again recently. And I think he wants me to work for peace. It's not about finding out what happened to him, which is my first impression, but I think he wants me to work for peace. So, or to leave a peaceful lifestyle, because again, this is not work. Thank you.
Oh, that's profound. Thank you, Stephen.
I think, for me, I think it's been really important to remember and find people that I admire and that serve as models. Some of these people are, of course, like Jesus and St. Francis, but even today, like people that really just live love and nonviolence in a way that I would, hope to lean into, and to stay in communication, those people, to know that this isn't about becoming one who controls how things turn out, right? This is about entering into a process, a just peace process, a process of love, being drawn into holiness, right? So it's a movement, it's a process, and then doing it with the people that inspire and offer that way of love in our context today, I think is what helps me to continue when things get really challenging, and sometimes it's hard to see a way out, right?
Thank you, Eli. Thank you for sharing.
For me, it's not as difficult, I think, because I tend to stick to the scholarly side of things. I talk the talk, but I don't always walk the walk. And so I can kind of intellectualize things away. But it can be overwhelming. Just, I think a lot, I write about a lot, I read a lot about war and conflict and genocide and mass killings and all these things. And so even though I'm safe in Middle America, and yeah, it can be. I think I get a sense, many of us do. I think Sister Rose had some earlier questions about, like, how do you keep hope? How do you keep from being overwhelmed by the challenges of climate change and war and poverty and things like that? I'm not much of a poetry person, but I'm going to share my screen real quick. I don't know if you can see that, but many of you might know this famous poem by Seamus Heaney, who wrote it at the depths of the troubles in Northern Ireland, where it seems like this endless cycles of violence. And I won't read the whole thing, but there's the famous stanza where history says, "Don't hope on this side of the grave, but then once in a lifetime, a longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme." And it's the beautiful poem. The rest of it kind of really is this idea of, we often don't have much reason to hope, but there is hope that sometimes the tide of justice really is a flow tide, not an ebb tide, and we can hold on to that.
Yeah, what a beautiful note to wrap our conversations around, right? The universe is really ordered towards hope and justice and love. Thank you. Thank you so much. Great thanks to our amazing speakers tonight. And if we can just either clap or just send our love to our speakers for such a beautiful presentation. Thank you. Thank you. And as we thank our speakers as well for this beautiful, beautiful sharing, we also thank everyone for the gift of your presence. You will agree that this has been a beautiful evening filled with the presence of the Holy Spirit. And as always, the video of this night's session, like all others before it, will be uploaded in the website, so you can always go back to view any part of it if you want. I'll now hand over, turn the floor back to Elaine to conclude the rest of the session. But this has been a great, great evening. Thank you.
Wow, 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 what a session. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dave, Eli, Stephen, Joachim, and thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope that our time together was meaningful and that you will continue the conversation in your cycle, in your communities, and everywhere you will be going after this session. Last session was our part 1, as you heard at the beginning of Living a Life of Synodality. Next week, we will be engaging students. A lot of students travel to Rome to participate in the synodality, to engage synod delegates, so they will be sharing their experience with us next week. Becky McIntyre, which is an amazing artist, an amazing young woman, who also is part of the planning team, is on this call. If she's would like to step here and maybe on mute to share a little bit more about next week. Becky, I know I'm putting you on the spot.
That's okay. Thanks, Eliane. Yeah, we just had a delegation of about 150 students and educators from 15 different universities in Rome last week. And many of them are are either involved in like different courses on synodality or have been doing synodal work on their campuses. And we all joined together last week to partake in this initiative together for the first time. We had some teach-ins, we had some luncheons with delegates, and had just were there to witness and to build protagonism among students. And then Friday we had the opportunity to be in the Synod Hall, and the Vatican hosted us with 4 panelists, Cardinal Grech, Cardinal Hollerich, Bishop Flores, and Sister Salazar, who are all delegates or on the leadership team of the Secretariat for the Synod. And we had a panel discussion with them, which was live streamed, which was the first time that anything like that has ever happened at the Vatican. So it was a pretty exciting week, and a great initiative to work together with so many leaders and so many students. And so I'm excited for students to share next week. And we had a few like co-responsibility circles where students got to come together and talk about different topics that mattered most to them within the social mission of the church. And so one of those circles was peace building and nonviolence. And so we are inviting students from that circle to share.
Thank you so much, Becky, for this primer. So we hope to see you next week on October 28th. Come here, same time, to hear from and learn from the student. Wish you a good evening and see you next week.